Welcome to the Untypical Parent podcast for parents in neurodivergent families. I'm Liz Evans and I'm your host. Here we talk about the messy and the sparkles, share ideas you can actually use, and give you space to take what could work and leave what doesn't. There's no such thing as a manual that perfectly fits a neurodivergent family. So the Untypical Parent podcast is here to make the hard bits lighter and the good bits brighter. Welcome to your backup team. We've been expecting you. I really am delighted today to welcome Kathy to the podcast. Kathy is the CEO and founder of the Autistic Girls Network Charity and a passionate advocate for neurodivergent individuals, particularly women and girls. With a deep understanding gained through both professional and personal experience and neurodivergent herself, Kathy's committed to fostering a world where autistic individuals are understood, accepted, and empowered. We're going to cover in the podcast a bit as well, some of this information, but just to let you know, Kathy's also an author of their highly acclaimed book, Nurturing Your Autistic Young Person, a practical guide for parents and carers. And driven by her desire to create more inclusive and supportive educational environments, Kathy has founded the Haven Online School, a tailored and nurturing learning experience for neurodivergent learners, recognising and celebrating their unique strengths and needs. Kathy, thank you ever so much for joining us on the Untypical Parent podcast today. It is lovely to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. So we've had a little intro to you, Kathy, and about what you do and who you are. But all my listeners are very used to the way that we start the podcast each episode, and that is to ask everybody that comes on, are you the perfect parent, Kathy?
Well, definitely no. Does anyone ever say yes?
You know, I've had a couple that have said yes, and then they laugh hysterically. I've
Oh,
had one person go, of course, and then just left it. And I thought, ooh, are they being serious? I've got the wrong person on the podcast. But no,
no,
they
I'm
weren't being
definitely not
serious.
the perfect parent. I think back and cringe about some of the things that I used to do, like trying to make my son look at me when I was
Yeah.
talking to him. I used to do that. No, definitely not the perfect parent. I'm not sure the perfect parent actually exists. Um, and if they do, I'm sure that they're a constant work in progress.
I don't believe it. If anyone said to me they were perfect, I'd be like, I don't trust you. There's something very wrong. There's no way
Yes,
you can be
very
perfect.
suspect. Yeah.
Yes, very, yeah. And I think, like you said, when we look back to kind of our parenting and maybe before we knew diagnoses or all those kind of things, is we go back to leaning on what we know, and we only know what you know.
Yeah.
And I think for me, my parenting has always been, I'm constantly learning. Even now, when I think I've got it pinned, and I go, yeah, I've got this, then there'll be
Yeah,
another curveball,
absolutely.
and I think, no, still haven't got it. And that's really
Yes.
hard work.
No, I agree. And I think that we just need to do the best that we can with the information that we've got.
Yeah.
And once you know different, you do different.
Yeah.
And if you don't do different, then yeah, that's where you're becoming really imperfect.
Yes.
But you have to do what you can with what you've got.
Yeah.
And as long as you're doing the best job that you can with that information, then I'm happy.
And I often think the parents that are going, or they're kind of listening to podcasts like this, or they're accessing the things that you offer, Kathy. And those parents often, I think, they're the great parents because they're constantly looking at, okay, well, what what don't I know? What could I do differently? What could I do to make this better? And they're the really great parents, not the ones that you see on Instagram with everybody smiling and happy and on their
No,
20-minute holidays.
the parents who want to learn, who
Absolutely.
realise that they have gaps in their knowledge and they want to, or even if they don't realise, but they're kind of trying to find out
Yes,
more, and then they start to realise that they have gaps in their knowledge. It's brave to realise that you have done things wrong and to
absolutely.
admit that you have done things wrong. It's much easier to think, okay, I haven't done anything wrong, I'm not the perfect parent, but I'm doing fine and I don't need to change anything.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a much easier road than to try and change what you've been doing.
And that's really interesting because all the podcasts that I've done more recently is I haven't heard anyone talk about that actually, about how brave it is to be able to say, I'm struggling, or I'm not managing this, or I want to be able to do things differently, or I haven't done this quite as I would like to have done. And even when we know lots of information, we can still do things where we think, "Hmm, maybe shouldn't have done that." Uh, um,
Of course we can. And probably we still do it, even once we've
Absolutely.
become more, clued up on everything. We probably still do it.
Yeah.
We have, I don't actually know the exact figure now, but we have over 32,000 people in our Facebook group for Autistic Girls Network. And I guess we're a little bit different to some groups, in that we are a mixed neurotype group.
Yeah.
You can be any neurotype to join. And so it's really, really important that we are all respectful to each other, and
Yeah.
all make allowances
Yeah.
for differences in communication, etc. And sometimes that's hard when
Yeah.
somebody is just joining and they're not used to that yet. And so we actually refuse a lot of posts. We have specific rules about, for example, not moaning about your autistic person.
Hmm.
Um, and we reject a lot of posts
Yeah.
because we aren't a parent support group. We're very open about that. That's in one of the rules, as we are not a parent support group. Of course, most of our members are parents.
Yeah.
Most of them are also neurodivergent themselves.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, it's absolutely fine to ask a question about how you parent if you're a neurodivergent parent and you're having difficulties, around that
Yeah.
issue. Um, but we don't allow posts that are basically just a moan about autistic children. And
Yeah.
sometimes that can be controversial, and sometimes people get annoyed because they're having an issue and they want to ask something. And so what we try and do is reframe the post, get them to reframe the post so that it's not a moan, it's actually asking, what can I do to
Yes.
support my child in
What can I
this
do differently?
situation? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
sometimes that's a learning curve that
yeah.
people have to, and it won't suit everybody, and maybe some people will immediately leave us. I
Yeah.
don't know. But it works for us, and it makes for a kinder group, I think, to everybody. And then everybody starts to realize, oh, this is how it works.
Mm. Mm.
And then you don't, for a long time you don't have any problems, and then you have an influx of people and the problems start again.
Yeah.
But that it tends to work quite well, and I think I don't know, it's almost like a metaphor for real life. This is how it should work in real life.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think there's always that worry, isn't there, when you start to get into that cycle of everything's terrible and lots of that, moaning or whatever it is, that actually you can get into these really horrible cycles. And actually the way out of that, it's not the way out of things, is to get into that circle that just, they can get bigger and bigger, those circles too, can't they? And like you
Well,
say,
they
quite
can, and also
uncontrollable.
it's like reframing your thoughts slightly. But we are very aware that some families are really, really struggling,
Yeah.
and they're not getting support
Yeah.
in any area, maybe in any of our systems.
Yeah.
Most of what is going on is a systemic problem. Our education system, our health system, our social care system, they are all pretty broken as
Mm.
far as supporting neurodivergent children and young people. Um, and that can be a huge issue for people. And if they are struggling, if they don't know how to co-regulate, they don't know how to um, teach their young person more about emotional regulation, and that means that young person is getting more and more dysregulated, and that will lead to challenging behavior, which is not a term I generally use,
Yeah.
but in that case, you can just see it building up. Um, then it can be a real
Mm.
struggle.
Mm.
But it's as much about the way things are framed, in questions, and you can get help in our group in that situation if you frame it,
Yeah.
how do I support my child? um, but
I was
as I
going to
said,
ask, I was going
that
to
won't
ask you,
be for everyone.
Polly, was where did it come from, the Autistic Girls Network? Where's the creation of that come from? I'm really interested.
Okay, so Autistic Girls Network as a charity, I turned it into a charity in November 2021, I think. But before that, it was just a Facebook group and a Twitter community, really,
Okay.
when Twitter was a thing.
Yeah, yeah,
We don't post on Twitter anymore, but it used to be a big campaigning part of what we did.
yeah.
So it's a shame that it's kind of all exploded, really. Um, but before that, there was a group that was called FIGS, which stood for Fighting Inequality for Girls on the Spectrum. That
Oh,
was founded by a lovely lady called Mandy, who had multiply neurodivergent children and had much, much more difficulty getting her daughter diagnosed than her son. And that was why that group started. And
amazing.
then I took it over, and it kind of grew and grew, and decided on changing it into a charity.
Mm.
I mean, changed my life as well.
Yeah.
Basically, I did that as a full-time job as a volunteer for 3 years.
Wow.
Um, and yeah, and then everything else changed, and now we're opening a school, and
So much stuff
my
coming.
world has gone crazy.
I can well imagine when I had a look at your website and what you're doing, and I know, and I see you on the socials and stuff like that. So much information, support, progression, things that you're offering it's amazing what you've got going on.
Well, I couldn't do it. So I was the only. So last year I was employed part-time, and that was amazing.
Mm.
Um, and then in December we got a part-time fundraiser, and in March we got a part-time volunteer coordinator. And we have a team of freelancers who do training and group facilitation and peer support groups and mentoring, and you couldn't do it without
So
all
you've
of
got a
them.
whole organisation behind you, Kathy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, they're all fabulous, and of course everyone's so passionate, because they're I think pretty much everybody that does any kind of work or volunteering for us is neurodivergent themselves,
Okay.
or they're the parent of
Yeah.
neurodivergent children.
Mm.
And so it's a maybe cause isn't the right word, but it's something that they're really passionate about,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they know that they would have. I mean, the number of people that say to me, oh, I wish that had been around when I was
Yeah.
younger, or when my children were younger, or and yeah, I wish it had been.
Mm.
And ultimately I wish that we don't need to exist,
Yeah.
but at the moment we definitely do.
And I suppose what's really interesting is you set this up for girls and women, is that, like you say, that there has to be a need for that because there is a difference, we know, in the diagnostics, don't we? And that girls notoriously are missed. Is that improving at all, Kathy? Is that changing?
I do think it is improving. In the time
Good.
that I've been doing this, I definitely think there is a lot more interest in talking about girls. This year, or maybe this academic year, we have done train our autism. So we have autism and girls training for schools. We have lots of school training, but that particular one, we have done that for three special schools,
Hmm.
who, of course, are perfectly used to neurodivergence, but actually they had hardly had any girls before, and they were starting to get a lot more girls.
Yeah.
And so they thought that they needed some training on how it presented in a different way. And I should say, we don't believe that in female autism and male autism doesn't exist. Internal versus external presentation is what we're talking about.
Yep.
So yes, some boys, certainly some non-binary young people, will present in that
Yes.
way, in that internal way, which
Yeah.
means that they're more likely to get missed. Girls equally may present in an external way, which means it's much more likely that they'll be diagnosed at the age of 3 or 4.
Yeah.
And if you are a girl and you were diagnosed at that age, probably you have a more external presentation.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And I suppose, like you say, it's such a shame that this has to be the case, that we need charities like you that you set up, that girls are getting missed. And I suppose the impact for those girls that are getting missed, then we've got parents now that are undiagnosed as, undiagnosed autistic. And sometimes I suppose we go through that process, don't we, as parents, that when our kids go through the diagnostics pathways, that we then start to go, Oh,
I think that's, I mean, in anecdotally, in the experience of people in our group, that's much more common than anything else, is that
yeah.
you, as an adult, you discover your neurodivergence when your child gets a diagnosis, because your normal is your normal. And how are
Yes.
you supposed to know what's going on in other people's
Yeah.
brains? So whatever happens in your household, you're doing things the same way as usually as what happened when you were a child, unless you had an awful childhood, of course. And probably if you're neurodivergent, one of your parents is also neurodivergent. It runs in families. So that's the thing. People are doing things in the way that they've been brought up to
Mm.
think of as normal, in inverted commas. Um, and it's because they're neurodivergent and they don't realize that other people are doing things differently, just
Yeah.
the same way as you don't realize for ages, probably until adulthood, if you're face blind, for example, or
Mm.
if you have aphantasia, so you can't really picture things in your mind.
Mm, mm.
Or I've seen a lot of posts from neurodivergent people saying, hey, is it true that people don't have an internal voice and things like that? But all of those things, you don't know whether
Yeah.
your experience is normal in
Yeah.
inverted commas or not, because you can't tell what's going on in other people's heads and they can't tell what's going on in yours.
Yeah. But then I suppose that's when the diagnostics become, and I have a difficulty with people going, oh, you don't need to get a diagnosis. And I think it's up to the person, because it's the self, if you believe that you're autistic, that is enough. And if that gives you the support that you need, that's enough. But what I do have problems with, and I remember back when I was very young qualified OT, and the local EP service in the area had decided they were no longer going to diagnose dyslexia. They weren't going to diagnose it because they didn't think it was helpful. And now I think having a diagnosis of dyslexia for me later in my life, now I've always known I was dyslexic, and I've talked about being dyslexic, but until I got that diagnosis, I don't think I truly understood it. And I had one of those real light bulb moments where I go, those things I found really hard. That's why.
Oh, absolutely. I did my master's dissertation on, well, it was actually on the checklist that's in our white paper, Autism
Mm,
Girls and Keeping It All Inside. But it was essentially what I was asking. I was asking autistic women, as one of the questions was, what difference do you think it would have made if you had been
yeah.
diagnosed earlier? So many people said, I wouldn't have been so vulnerable. I might not have been abused. And they were talking about all different kinds of abuse, not just
Yeah.
sexual abuse.
Yeah.
But so many people felt that they were put in a more vulnerable position by not knowing that they were neurodivergent.
Mm,
And as a charity, our position is that self-diagnosis is completely valid.
yeah.
And as exactly as you say. However, you are, unfortunately, in our systems, you are disadvantaged if you
Yeah.
don't have evidence. And that it's that piece of paper that is the evidence. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, if you don't get a diagnosis, you're unlikely to have any kind of evidence. So, for example, disabled students allowance when
Yeah.
someone goes to university, you can't get that if you don't have a diagnosis. It's
Yeah.
not based on need anymore. It used to be. It's not based on need, it's based on having a diagnosis and having that proof. So if you don't have that, you can't get DSA. Now, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And, in things like getting benefits, for example, even getting an EHCP, which is meant to be needs based.
Yeah.
I'm sure we all know so much about this. It's all meant to be needs based. Getting PIP, for example, not
Mm,
meant to be based on getting the diagnosis. But if you don't have the diagnosis, you don't have the evidence,
yeah.
and you need an evidence trail to be able to get it.
It's almost like a bit of a
So
key,
it's
isn't it?
it's dangerous, I think, to say to people, "Oh, you don't need a diagnosis."
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And I
And
think
also, even things like getting an EHCP. My son was diagnosed very late, and he didn't have an EHCP at school, although he should have done.
okay.
Um, and it was very difficult for him to get PIP because they said, "Oh, you didn't have an EHCP, so you don't need it." So even that was
Okay.
it was being weaponized against him,
Mm, mm,
that actually he'd been missed
mm.
and misdiagnosed
Yeah.
and pretty much neglected in not getting an EHCP, which would have really benefited him. And we were at the early stages of our knowledge at the
Yeah.
time, and so didn't pursue it. And we were dealing with other stuff at the time, so didn't pursue it. But actually, that made life difficult for him. It also meant that he couldn't get a supported internship. So it's not as simple as saying to people, "Oh, you don't need a diagnosis."
Mm-mm. And some parents, I suppose, might be out there thinking, I don't want to I've heard that conversation a lot, haven't they? I don't want a label for my child.
Yes.
And I think when I look back and I think, having a diagnosis later and knowing that later, for me, I would say my mental health has been affected by not knowing earlier. I think there's a lot of anxiety around me for
Mm.
certain areas, but
Yeah,
also I think the
I've got a
diagnosis,
whole chapter on that in my book.
yeah,
If you don't get that label, you get other labels.
yes,
You get labels like weird or drama queen or
yes.
all of those things.
Yeah, and I was
Um,
always called the anxious child. I was always an anxious
yeah,
child. And I thought, well,
yeah, or
now I know
sensitive.
why.
Oh, he's so sensitive.
Yes.
Um, it's I mean, yes, maybe he is sensitive, but there's a reason why.
Yeah.
He's sensitive because his sensory system is in overload and all of those things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not really one. I'm definitely not one for that argument.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we see that quite a lot in our Facebook group. Parents who come and say a professional, or a friend or a grandparent has said, "Oh, why do you want them to get a label?"
Mm.
And yeah, we have lots of very good arguments against that.
There are. There are. I think even just personally for me, but also like for my son as well, we didn't get a diagnosis for him until it was a bit later down the line. And it's almost like a key to the next step. I couldn't get to the next step. Although everyone's saying to me, like you said, oh, the HCP, you can get it without a diagnosis. Yeah, but it's really, really hard. And it's hard enough as
Mm.
it is, even with a
Yes.
diagnosis. So it's almost like a key to the next step that you needed to be able to get there. And that's hard. That's really hard when you haven't got
And
those.
also, why wouldn't somebody want validation that that's what's going on and that's the reason for some things that have happened
And
in
I
their
learned
lives?
loads about myself. It
Mm.
came back to um, things I hadn't even really thought were part of being dyslexic. And when I read this report, thought, oh, that's part of the dyslexia. I thought that was just, I was struggling or I wasn't so good at or whatever it is, that then you get into that kind of negative stuff in your head and
Oh, absolutely. And especially when now we realize that there's so much co-occurrence.
Mm.
So, what we should be doing is when somebody gets any kind of neurodivergent diagnosis, what we should be doing is we should be screening for other
yeah.
neurodivergencies. My daughter is autistic, ADHD, dyspraxic, and dyslexic. Those are her diagnoses. Um, we stopped at that point. Maybe there's more, I don't know. But after that, it didn't feel like there was much more point, and she wouldn't have got any more support. But each of them brought its own understanding
Mm.
and validation. Each of them is some days more of a challenge and some days more of a joy. There are just as many joyful points about being autistic, being ADHD, as there are challenges. But each day is different, and each day one part of her, I suppose, might be more prevalent. So
Yeah.
one day, it might be a sensory overload day. One day it might be a hyper focus ADHD day. One day it might be, a real struggle reading something, for her dyslexia. Another day, she's got her Kindle and she can completely hyper focus on
Mm.
and read a whole book, which is a big deal. She didn't have a dyslexia diagnosis until she was 17. Really, she didn't read a book before that.
Yep.
And now she costs me a fortune in ebooks. So having that, getting that diagnosis and realizing why the
Yeah.
letters and numbers were moving around the page, or whatever happens in her brain, because obviously it's different for everybody.
Yes. Yeah.
um, Getting that validation of why that was happening
Mm.
was a huge deal to her, maybe the hugest deal. Her first diagnosis was autism, and that was a huge deal. But
Yeah.
maybe the dyslexia diagnosis actually made more difference than all the others.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's different for everybody, and I don't think anybody has the right to say why do you want to label yourself?
Yeah. What I was really interested as well about what you offer, Kathy, as well, is that a lot of the work that I do and is for parents, and I have to keep saying it's not because we don't care about the kids and we're ignoring the kids' needs, because that comes part and parcel of being a parent. But what I'm trying to do with parents is help them focus a bit and equal some of the focus on need to be inclusive of them as well, because we often see, and probably you've seen as well, as parents in additional needs families, that often we are pushed to our limits. And I don't necessarily always mean by the kids, by the environments that we find ourselves in,
Oh,
systems
the
that we
systems.
navigate,
Yeah.
and that, all that kind of thing. Actually, I think our kids are the small part
So
of
do I.
stress. I think it's the other stuff that causes us the stress, and can make us quite poorly and unwell at times, when we're in crisis. Is what I love is that, and I would say to people, if you're listening to this, is go and have a look at the Autistic Girls Network, because actually you've got a section in there for women that would be for parents that might be thinking maybe they're autistic. They might know that they're autistic, but actually it's about support for them and not just
Mm.
about their kids.
Yeah, no, it's not just about kids. So for probably the first couple of years, most of our, well, other than our Facebook group, which is obviously mostly adults, well, almost entirely adults, almost entirely women, actually, almost entirely neurodivergent women,
Yep.
actually. Um, so obviously, that is adult support. But we also do peer support groups for autistic women, but that's relatively recent. And I
Okay.
would say probably for the first few years, we did concentrate mainly on young people. Actually, for us, mostly teens. Most of our
Okay.
face-to-face groups are for teens because tends to be the age group where most are in crisis. So that felt like, because we kind of exist because of undiagnosed or unrecognized, I should say, neurodivergence causing mental health issues,
Yeah.
or resulting in, perhaps causing is not the right word, resulting in mental health issues because of all the other things that we've talked about and systemic lack of support.
Yeah.
Um, I think we felt like that was the area that we needed to concentrate on. And so we did concentrate on that and still do, for face-to-face groups, concentrate on that. But, we know that autistic women needed some support as well. So peer support groups have been very popular. Um, and we do some mentoring, which when we've got funding for it, which we haven't at the moment, um, which goes up to 25 as
Oh,
well.
amazing.
So yeah, there has been support for, and we do family workshops as well. So we've got lots of videos on our YouTube channel, loads now, actually. I don't even know how many. And we have started to do family workshops, which we then record and you can purchase for a small amount on our
Okay.
website.
Amazing.
So yeah, there is definitely support for families as well.
Yeah. And we'll put all your details obviously in the show notes so people can find this. If they're interested in the things that you've talked about, Kathy, we'll pop them in there so they can
Yeah.
find you nice and easily. Um, the other thing that I spotted on your website, which was really exciting, was something about the Haven. So this is new.
Yes, this is new. This
Tell us
is
about the
our
Haven, Kathy.
So the Haven is our new online school, which is now starting really scarily soon
Yeah.
for me, in September. It's for neurodivergent girls and non-binary young people aged 12 to 17,
Yep.
to start with,
Yep.
because we don't have investors. We are funding it purely from the charity, so we need to
Okay.
start
Yeah.
small, and grow sensibly. Um, and it is likely to be that either people will be coming from home ed where they want a bit more structure as they get towards
Yep.
GCSE years, or and probably what is more likely is our cohort will be probably a very traumatized one who have dropped out of school for various reasons, because they have been so many barriers to
Yeah.
school attendance and school enjoyment, and school, not even enjoyment, but being able to tolerate
Yeah.
school,
Yeah.
for whatever reason.
I mean, this sounds amazing. When I was having a look through it, and just even some of the language that you use about it being neuroaffirming and stuff like that, is so lovely to see. Because my son is educated in other than at school. He's on the ATAS package at home, um, and trying to find the learning side of it for him has been really tricky. And we use an online provider. They're great to a point. It misses the fact, I think, that it's not neuroaffirming. They try to be, but it's not. It's not set up in that way.
Yeah, I mean, this is our cohort. We know our cohort super well.
Yeah.
And we have a huge school training package or packages now. In the last academic year, we've trained about 150 schools.
Oh, brilliant.
So, we do the training for this for teachers.
Yeah.
As it happens, the core educators that I've recruited for September are all neurodivergent. I'm not promising that they always will be, because I think that would be a silly thing for me to promise. But I can say that if we employ educators who aren't neurodivergent themselves, very likely that they will have a link to neurodivergence. And that's why they're so passionate
Yeah.
about joining us, because we had a huge number of applications for these roles. But also they will have access to our entire body of school training. So they will be very educated
Yeah. Yeah.
about neurodivergence. So, we, in our interviews for these positions, a lot of the questions revolved around, of course, safeguarding, of course, how do you adapt teaching for online learning? Because it's not the same. When we're
Yeah.
not talking about what happened in COVID, it's just not the same thing at all.
Yeah.
But also, how do you adapt for different kinds of neurodivergencies?
Yeah.
And we had a really fun interview um, for a science teacher. And I think the question was about how do you adapt for an autistic learner who has very specialized special interests and is not interested in how you're teaching it at the moment? What would you do? And he was being a little bit vague in his answer. So I said, let's be specific. The special interest is Pokemon. How would you adapt for that? And he said, just a minute. And he went off and he got his folder of Pokemon cards, came back, moved his camera to the desk and said, what do you want me to teach? And I said, I don't know, circuits. And he proceeded to teach me circuits using only Pokemon cards. And it was brilliant.
Oh, how
Um,
amazing.
there are so many different ways that you can engage learners. And yes, you can't do some things that you can do face to face, but actually you can do other stuff that
Mm.
you wouldn't be able to do face to face.
Mm.
I think I might have just said that the wrong way around, but I'm sure you know what I mean. Uh, so yeah, there are lots of exciting things that you can do. And there are interesting ways that you can use AI, for example, to create some exciting lesson plans, and everything like that. I think that it's going to be very important that we are respectful of everybody, of all of our learners. We realize that a lot of them may have been traumatized. We don't call ourselves school, we don't call ourselves teachers. um, you don't have to put the camera on, although it would be better if everyone had their camera on, because it's going to be much easier to build community.
Yeah.
So what we hope and what we think is our responsibility is we need to create a psychologically safe space where everyone feels comfortable to put their
Mm.
camera on and to speak out. We're very aware that some may be situationally mute and may not be able to speak, and there are lots of other ways that you can engage. And you can have a private message to the educator. You can do lots of different things. You can engage them with polls. There's lots of ways of knowing that they're there and engage without them having to speak, for example, or without them having to put on their camera. So we consider it to be our goal to create that psychologically safe space so that they can engage more
Yeah. And that's so
in a way.
important, isn't it? I think I'm just thinking back to my son and when we made that transition and the trauma from school for him, and making that step back into learning again, actually online was a really good way for him to do that. It gave him a sense of control back. The camera didn't have
Yes,
to
and
be on.
autonomy is
No.
the most important
Yeah,
thing, you know,
huge.
and so Monday to Thursdays we're doing more academic-y stuff, but Fridays is our passion-led, project-led day,
Yeah,
and that is where autonomy comes to the fore. What we hope from that is that our learners will co-design with their tutor a project about something that they're passionate about,
amazing.
and they will co-design a 5-week project. We will match it to aspects of the English, maths, and science curriculum. We have a competency framework that we've designed that aligns to points in those curriculums. I'm sure there's a proper word for the plural of curriculums, but I can't remember what it is. And then, we want that learner to be in charge of their own learning. So what we'll be saying to them as part of the co-design is you need to pick 5 competencies that you're going to match or you're going to be able to tick off in that 5-week
Yeah,
project. So which ones are you going to be able to do?
yeah,
And so they choose them. And when it gets to week 3 or week 4, they've been regularly meeting with their tutor. And, what we want them to say is, I've ticked this competency. And then the tutor can say either, yes, you have, or you've done it brilliantly, or they can say, oh, I think you need to do a little bit more of such and such
yeah.
before you've quite got it. And so that autonomy is going to be absolutely the most important thing.
It's
But
huge that.
equally, we can say to Ofsted, we are offering a broad and balanced
Mm,
curriculum.
mm,
But we're not pushing learning down their throats.
yeah.
They're learning in a way that is more exciting for them, more interesting for them. And hopefully that will relax them into the other learning. Because
Yeah.
obviously, for GCSE English, for example, there's
Yeah.
not that much choice about what you can do. You
Yeah.
have to follow the curriculum.
Yeah.
And so, and people say to me, well, what about PDA? How do you deal with PDAs? And we say, well, we're very aware of the needs of PDAs without meaning to generalize. Of course, everybody is different. Um, but we can't remove every demand. We have to have a timetable
Yeah.
because our educators need to know when they're teaching. They have their own families. Everyone needs to know when to turn up for live lessons. So it's not possible to remove all demands, even from this environment. It's not possible. So there has to be, you have to be able to cope with a certain number of demands. But it's whether we can lower, make a low arousal environment for everything else, so that anxiety ramps down
Yeah.
and you're able to cope with some of those demands.
Yeah. Yeah. It's finding, isn't it, what works for each person, and it's not always the same thing for everybody, is it?
No,
So
of course it's not. Of
it's
course it's not.
finding, and what you're doing though is providing something for that cohort of kids that are in that space and need that approach, and so that's definitely been a huge thing for my son, be able to kind of transition to that, and he now is on camera and will talk in specific classes.
Yeah.
But we're not obviously in something as specialized as what you're offering. It's much more generalized, and they're doing the best with what they've got and the knowledge that they've got. And it's worked for him so far. And he's starting to think about possibly next steps and where that might be, and whether that's he say where he is to do his GCSEs, or actually whether he looks at a more bricks and mortar type environment. We're not sure yet, so that's kind of up in the air
Yeah.
for us. But it's definitely been the bridge for us, and it has rescued us.
Yeah, and that's the
Yeah, on
thing,
that
isn't it? It
online.
can make all the difference. It won't suit
Huge,
everybody. It
huge.
wouldn't suit my daughter. She would not have coped with online learning. But that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's why we exist, because one size
Yes.
doesn't fit all.
No.
There has to be choice. There has to
Yeah.
be options.
Yeah.
And I would love, if it's one of our long-term aims as a charity is to have face-to-face provision, but we don't have the funding for that
Yeah.
at the moment.
Yeah.
Maybe a few years down the line, maybe
Never
we'll have
know.
Haven, Oxford, Haven, Manchester, who knows?
Yeah.
But at the moment we're
Yeah.
not there.
Yeah.
But online feels a good compromise to
Yeah.
start with.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. I
And we
think
have
it's
small
amazing.
class sizes. We cap our class sizes at 8.
Yeah.
So it's more likely that somebody is going to start to feel comfortable enough to engage.
Mm.
We'll keep those classes together. So, you'll be doing English and maths and science. If
Okay.
those are what you're doing, you'll be doing those with the same
Mm,
8 people. So that will help a bit, I think.
sounds brilliant.
And
There's,
also, doing exams at home is also going to be
yes,
an
yeah,
important part.
because I don't think people realise that that could happen. I didn't realise that that
Well,
could
it
happen.
can only, so it's Pearson Online, and it can only happen with international schools or online schools.
Yes,
So of course there are ways that you can do it in a mainstream school, but it's very, very hard
yeah,
to
yeah,
get that option.
yeah,
But yes, we will have remote invigilation, so they won't need to go to a strange exam unless they want to. They won't
yeah,
need to go to a strange exam centre.
yeah. There's another thing that I know I want to catch in here and make sure that we don't run out of time to talk about, because I know Kathy said to me, I'm not very good at talking about this bit, that actually Kathy has a book out. So,
I
Kathy, tell
do.
us a little bit about the book that you've got out at the moment, because I know you said, well, I can talk about it, but not quite, I'm not so quite so
Yeah,
comfortable
I'm not
talking
very
about
good
what
at
you
talking
do.
about it.
Yeah.
This summer we've done a lot of exhibitions and shows, and it's always good if I have other people on the stand with me because they can talk about the
Yeah.
book and I don't have to talk about it myself. But yes, it's called Nurturing Your Autistic Young Person, and it's a handbook for adults, um, with regards, getting a diagnosis, negotiating that kind of newness of diagnosis or recognition, doesn't have to be a medical diagnosis, for preteens and teens, and all of the things that I tried to cover everything really that you might need to know. So there's stuff about co-occurring conditions, there's stuff about meltdowns and shutdowns, there's stuff about EHCPs, there's stuff about benefits, there's stuff about, possible next steps and transitions and all of that, really.
So it sounds real practical, kind of.
Yes, it's a kind of a dip in, dip out
Yeah,
type of book. I'm lucky it's got lots of very nice reviews on Amazon.
brilliant. And did I hear you say, is that what you were doing the audio recording for?
Yes, it's got an audio book. Yeah.
Brilliant. Because I always like
three
that.
days because it was 80,000 words, that book. So it took 3 days to
Oh,
record the
Kathy,
audio book.
that is a long time.
My voice
I'm
did go
pleased
a
to hear
bit.
there's an audio book, because I always go, because as an autist and as a dyslexic person, I find it really difficult with the reading. My first question usually is it on audiobook?
It is on audio book.
Brilliant, brilliant. Kathy, just to kind of tie it up, I don't know whether obviously there's parents will be predominantly listening to this, and they might be having a really tricky time at the moment. If there was one tip, and this is really generalized and really hard to do, if there was one tip you could give a parent that was struggling at the moment, what would it be?
I think it would be, I might have to split out my tip a little bit. So
You can do
it's a
that.
bit slightly cheating. I think it would be learning about emotional regulation and alexithymia,
Yeah.
which is someone having real difficulty identifying and expressing emotions. And
Mhm.
over half of autistic people are alexithymic. I personally, I think it's well over half. Um, so understanding that so that you can help your child to learn about emotional regulation and you can co-regulate with them, because if you can't stay as calm as possible, and I know that sometimes that's a tall order, and help them co-regulate, they are not going to be able to learn to emotionally regulate.
Mm.
And that means they're going to become more and more dysregulated, and your life is going to become more and more chaotic and sometimes miserable. So the best thing that you can do is to stay calm and learn about that stuff so that you can help them
Yeah.
become more emotionally regulated. And then the thing is, with high anxiety, everything ramps up, sensory reactions ramp
Yeah.
up. You can't bear to hear someone chew, sometimes you can't wear any clothes,
Yeah.
your sensory
Hmm.
sensitivities are so high. um you know and if you can just dampen everything down, it does start to really help, and it makes a difference to everything that happens in your life. So that I would say, that learn about emotional regulation.
Yeah, no, I'm big for that one. Being an OT, I think. And
Yes.
I've done, I've got like a short webinar out that I do with parents about understanding the sensory side of parenting. So understanding it from their perspective. So like you said, it's really hard, isn't it, to try and co-regulate someone else when you're dysregulated as a parent.
Yes,
A
of
lot of
course
the
it is.
time, parents don't recognize their own sensory needs. They'll know about their kids because they've had an OT come in and see them, and they might be know about those. But actually, there's a key bit missing there, which is about
Mm.
actually our regulation as parents and our sensory needs, and but they can clash quite
They
spectacular.
can, yeah. And of course, you might have kids whose sensory needs also clash. You might have an
Absolutely.
entirely, I mean, many of us have an
Yes.
entirely neurodivergent family. I know I do. And all of your needs might clash,
Yeah,
and navigating that is hard,
it
but
is
it can
really.
be done.
Yes. No, I agree with you with that. Emotional regulation. Kathy, thank you ever so much for coming on to the podcast. We will make sure that all of your contacts and details are in the show notes so people can catch you and be part of what's going on, can access all the amazing
Thank
things
you.
that you're doing at the moment, your book, all those kind of things. Wish you loads of luck with the book and the Haven. Sounds brilliant.
Thank you.
But thank you ever so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.